Hey, I'm DJ Sixsmith. You're watching The Sit Down. Author Jen Bryant is here with us. She's got a brand new book, Feed Your Mind. How are you?
Hi, thank you for having me.
You got it.
I'm good, thanks.
How has this part of your career been going? What was it like putting this book together?
Well, I've done many of these picture book biographies. Each one is a little different journey. Each one is distinctly itself. And at the same time, there are some things that are in common. So I guess my specialty, my area that I really like to concentrate on is the creative process. So whenever I find someone that I'm really intrigued by, that I feel is maybe outstanding in their field but underknown, particularly for a younger age group of readers, that's what I like to focus on. So I've done people like William Carlos Williams, the poet. And if you're a poet, you know William Carlos Williams, but not so many kids knew who he was. And so I try and find an aspect of their lives that is really accessible to kids. So he was a pediatrician, kid's doctor, and he used to write his poems on notepads and prescription pads and things like that. So
that's cool.
It usually starts with a little nugget of something. And in this case, I went to our local theater in Malvern, Pennsylvania, and I saw 7 guitars. And the play, within the first 10, 15 minutes of the play, I was just knocked out by the language. I had never heard dialogue like that. The characters were wonderful. They were intelligent, but they were earthy. They were real. They were mythical. They were ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. And I knew a little bit about August Wilson, but during the break between acts, I went up into the lobby and read a little bit about his childhood. And what really struck me was that he dropped out of high school. And he self-educated himself at the Carnegie Public Library. And I thought, well, there's my little thing that I'm going to follow. Now, sometimes I'll find something like that, and it will be a dead end. But in his case, not at all. There was so much richness in his life, and it just became a topic that I really wanted to share with kids.
That's awesome. So yeah, like you said, kids don't even know who August Wilson is. They can connect with his story based on the fact that he's going through the aisles and reading off the labels, and then he's totally self-taught. So what was most fascinating about that story to you? Yeah,
well, a few things. One is that if I made that up, if I took that story to a publisher and said, here's this 15-year-old boy, 175 pounds, strong kid who basically doesn't have a father who's around, and he's going to quit high school and he's going to go to the library. Right? What kind of a choice is that? So it's an amazing choice that if I made it up, no one would believe it, but it's actually what he did. So to me, the authenticity in that story and him honoring his, I would say, his intellect and his curiosity in that way. And a lot of that was because of his mother, actually. She only had a 6th grade education, and she cleaned houses, but from the beginning, she made sure her children had books. And as soon as she discovered that he was reading off of things in the apartment, she took him down to the library and got him his own library card at age 5. And he started taking out books. And his entire life, he said he was wedded to the library and wedded to books and wedded to literature. Not that he didn't do other things that other young boys did. He played basketball. He got into fights. He hung out on the street. But he loved language. And that was really another sort of extraordinary thing about him, is that he always had this fascination with language, and it was sort of waiting to see what would happen with that.
What do you think makes his language unique?
I think he had an amazing ability, which he also worked at. I mean, that's another theme in the book. If you have ability, you also need to work with it and for it. And so I think he learned to listen to how people speak. In the way that many poets do. And I'll say Robert Frost is one that probably a lot of people know. He also had an extraordinary ear for ordinary language. And so he would take conversations that he would hear in the jitney taxi station, or that he would hear in the diner, or that he would hear just on the street, and he would transform that into dialogue in his plays. So I think that was a gift, but it was a gift that he worked at too.
That's really cool. So this book is beautiful, and obviously for the creative process, for a playwright to have this sort of illustration, I think is perfect with stories. So what was it like kind of working with some other people to really make this appealing, and also for kids to be able to have that entry point to be like, all right, I'm down to read this because it looks just so wonderful to check out. Right.
Well, the interesting thing, picture books, and I love the genre because for me as a writer, I can combine research and poetry. So I grew up doing a lot of reading, but in the time before we had sort of wonderful nonfiction, we had the sort of drier, chunks of paragraphs, original document, textbook-like reading. And while you could get information, you weren't necessarily moved emotionally. So I really enjoy trying to make a book that kids will connect with on an emotional level. And the illustrator's job is to do that too, but through his or her own art. So Canaday, I have actually not met Canaday Chapman.
Oh my gosh, really?
Yes.
Isn't that like perfectly emblematic of the world that we live in right now, digitally?
Is. Although it's the way it usually works. I will say I did some previous biographies with Melissa Sweet, and she and I were put together on our first project of 3, and we didn't know each other then too, and that was the William Carlos Williams book. So I never met her until we went to an award ceremony for that book.
Wow.
Yeah. Then we worked together on 2 other books, but most of the time, illustrators and writers work separately. If they're not the same person, there are some very talented people who can do both, but in general, it's a kind of an arranged marriage. And I saw Canaday's collage work in the New York Times. And I made a note of it, and at the same time, unbeknownst to me, my editor did too. She spotted, and she just made a note to say, hey, let's check this guy out. And he had never done a book before. So he had done illustrations, he had done New Yorker covers. So we approached him, and he agreed to it, and boy, he just knocked it out of the park. So I think he has a wonderful mix of modernism, but also honors artistic traditions, has studied traditional artists and also modern techniques, and he combines them really, really well. And he was really fascinated with this story too, and that really helps. You have to have an emotional connection to the story.
Yeah, there has to be a buy-in because it shows in the work. And I think for this story in particular, it's like for a 2019 audience, we're going to have the new looking art, but at the same time, like, this is a classic guy growing up doing his own thing, talking about the theater world, which is very rooted in tradition. And I feel like you guys really blended that all together really nicely.
Well, thanks. It was like I said, it was a journey for both of us, and that's the wonderful thing about picture books is it's much more collaborative than you would think.
Totally.
Even though we're working separately, there are thousands of decisions that go into every single book. So I have a lot of decisions to make in terms of the writing. For instance, there were fascinating things that don't get into the book.
Like what? Give me a couple examples.
Well, for example, he had family and friends and colleagues. He worked with director Lloyd Richards. He had 2 daughters. He was married 3 times. All of that's important to his life, but this is, in a picture book biography, I'm keeping the focus tightly on the subject themselves. So all of that is in the timeline in the back, but the part of the story that I really focused on was, how did Freddie Kittle become August Wilson, and how did he discover his writing process? And it's just that. So there's so much around that. There were interesting little tidbits, like there was a woman in his neighborhood that used to round up all the kids and take them to church on Sunday.
Interesting.
And made sure everyone, got there. It was fascinating, but it didn't, in the end, fit in the narrative.
Right, there's only so much you can fit in this here.
Exactly.
How did you get into biographies and picture books and that whole niche?
Well, sort of by accident. I am friends with Jerry and Eileen Spinelli. They're both well-known children's authors. Eileen is also a poet, and I showed her some of I came to children's writing through adult poetry, which sounds
interesting.
Sounds like maybe it wouldn't be the same thing, but I find a lot of crossover.
Yeah, I can see the parallels there.
Yeah. And I've always loved visual art. I can't even draw a stick figure myself, but I appreciate it. And I had written a lot of poems about the artist Georgia O'Keeffe. Mm-hmm. And Eileen and Jerry and I went to an exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art about Georgia O'Keeffe. And I happened to bring my poems with me and showed them to Eileen. And she said, wow, she said, you could really tweak this a little bit, and this could be a picture book manuscript for a children's book. And I said, really? And she said, yeah. She said, your poetry is very narrative. And she shared with me, her picture book manuscript. So she was really the one, and I ended up writing a book called Georgia's Bones about Georgia O'Keeffe and her desert paintings. And I dedicated it to Eileen because she was the one that really, showed me how there was a lot of crossover.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
What do you like about Georgia O'Keeffe? What speaks to you about her work?
Well, she was ahead of her time. Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting, I'm so glad you asked me that, because when I do a new topic like August Wilson, it makes me think of the commonalities with the other biographies that I've done. Right. And, with all of them, they improvise so well. Wherever the person is, whether it's August Wilson in literally his backyard in the Hill District of Pittsburgh, or it's Georgia O'Keeffe in the same, 5 square acres of desert, or it's William Carlos Williams in his car with his prescription pads, they use what's at hand and they make beautiful art. And that's really genius, So, and I also think it's a great message for kids to, you don't need necessarily to go to art school or to writing school. You can use what's at hand and create art from where you are.
Or you don't have to go to the biggest school in your area or the Ivy League school. You can just go to the school that works for you, or you don't even need to go to school, and it can still work out for you.
Exactly, yes, or to the library.
Or to the library.
Or to the library.
So who are some other people along the way that have influenced you from a writing perspective, an art perspective? Who are some really impactful people when you think about your career?
I have to say, well, when I read an adult biography by Roxana Robinson of Georgia O'Keeffe, and just there are a lot of letters in there that she wrote to her sisters and her friends, and how there was a lot of self-doubt. Same thing with August Wilson. One of the poems that I insisted be included is when he said to his friends, "I can't write plays, man." That was one of the quotes, and look what he did.
Yeah, he wrote a few good ones.
He did. He has a theater down the street named after him. So. The self-doubt, I think, that everybody has as they're trying to find their own voice, whether that's in visual art or whether it's in writing. With Georgia O'Keeffe, I think I learned a lot from her diligence, just trying things and being okay with making mistakes, but then realizing that mistakes, 8 or 10 or 12 mistakes would then lead to sort of an aha moment. So I actually have learned a lot about writing from visual artists, the Wyeth family. We live near Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. Reading their biographies and how they teach themselves to see things a little bit differently, or they just drill down into the same geographical space and end up with 1,000 paintings. Again, very similar to the way August Wilson used his neighborhood and the people right around him to make very universal art.
Yeah, it's amazing how you can be unconventional and create universal things for people, and just that you can fail, and that is perfectly okay.
Yes,
and you need to fail.
Yes, and I mean, all of us go through, or most of us go through formal schooling, and it's a difficult, because I think even I know a lot of teachers, and I have been a teacher before, and the formal education system is sort of based on having the right answers at the right time. Right. But art definitely doesn't work like that.
No, absolutely not.
Right? Yeah. So it's sort of a freeing kind of learning, and I guess that's why I've done more creative artists than any other kind of achiever.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it's not like you can teach something like this in school. You kind of have to experience it. You get your basic principles, get your schooling and your training, but then you have to go out there and figure it out.
Yes, and develop your own voice.
Absolutely, most importantly.
Right? Yeah, so there are methods, but then there's your own unique spin on that. And that's what I love about the art of biography, really. I mean, there are quite a few very good biographers working in children's books now, quite a few, and I love them all. But we each have our own sort of way, much like I would say painting a portrait. You know, so if 100 people painted your portrait, you'd have 100 very different portraits, even though we're all looking at you, because we bring our own choices and our own aesthetic, our own experiences to the act of painting your portrait. And I think in the art of biography, that's why I keep coming back to the genre, because it's just fascinating to try and look at a life, and then it was challenging to make the choices, you know, that you have to make in order to deliver that life to a younger audience.
No question about it, Jen. Really nice to meet you.
Thanks
So much for
really
coming.
Really enjoyed it.
Check out Jen's book, Feed Your Mind. For Jen, I'm DJ. See you next time here on The Sit Down.